Hopefully she can understand where I'm coming from the weekly basis. And lovely, we have Brad and Gary as your readers for this morning, per normal for most Sundays. And they are going to be reading to you from the newspapers, as always, for your live reading. And I'm going to get going on your live reading for you. So I'm going to hand it on over to the two of them, and they're going to get started on your live reading for you.
Morning, Brad. Morning, everyone.
Morning, Gary. Good to be here another Sunday, and happy Mother's Day.
Absolutely. Let's start off with an article from the New York Times written by Richard Paddock from Bangkok. Activist's mother in Thailand faces a long prison term for one-word Facebook reply. The mother of a pro-democracy activist faces up to 15 years in prison after acknowledging that she had received a private message on Facebook that the police say insulted Thailand's monarchy. The activist's mother, Pantri Chinka, age 40, who works as a maid, will be tried by a military court under Thailand's majestic law, which makes it a crime to insult the long-reigning king, the queen, or the crown prince. On Saturday, human rights activists called Ms. Pantera's arrest a day earlier a new low for Thailand, which has increased prosecutions under the majestic law since the military took power in 2014. Poonsak Sharan, a lawyer advising Ms. Pantera, said she had sent only a one-word reply, ja, acknowledging receipt of the Facebook message, similar to saying yeah, but had not expressed agreement with it or commented on its content. The message was not made public so as not to repeat the alleged insult, as is typical in such cases. The sender of this message, Buran Aiten, age 28, was arrested last month. Colonel Sakasan, chief of the police technology crime suppression division, told reporters that the authorities had enough evidence to show that the pair had carried out things together. He did not provide specifics, saying the investigation was continuing. Human Rights Watch said Saturday that the military junta in Thailand had arbitrarily and aggressively used the majestic law to prosecute people for any speech deemed critical of the monarchy. Since the coup 2 years ago, the authorities have brought 57 cases under the law, 44 of them involving online commentary, the rights group said. Among those who have been investigated under the law are a factory worker accused of insulting the king's dog, a scholar accused of insulting the king who died centuries ago, and Ambassador Davies of the United States, who, despite his diplomatic immunity, was investigated after he criticized long prison sentences handed out under the law. One man is serving 30 years in prison for a post he distributed on Facebook. The Thai junta has sunk to a new low by charging an activist's mother under the insulting the monarchy law, which has been symptomatically abused to silence critics, said Brad Adams, the Asian director of Human Rights Watch. Prosecuting someone for her vague response to a Facebook message is just the junta's latest outrageous twist of the majestic law.
From the Omaha World Herald, when scientists grow human embryos for lab research, they end their experiments at the 14-day mark. Until now, these internationally accepted guidelines have been largely self-regulating. The record for in vitro gestation was just 9 days, and most labs struggle to keep embryos alive longer than a week. But now a pair of research teams from Rockefeller University and the University of Cambridge have both kept embryos alive nearly twice as long. And because they had to terminate their experiments preemptively to avoid going past the 14-day line, there is no telling how long they could have watched the development of their cultured human embryos. The resulting studies, which have sweeping ethical implications, were published last week in the journals Nature and Nature Cell Biology. Using techniques previously developed by Cambridge University's Magdalena Goetz, new reports say work for mice with embryos. The research teams were able to mimic the process of womb implantation within a petri dish, allowing embryos to continue growing and organizing their cells past the 1 week mark. It's the most enigmatic and mysterious stage of human development, said Getz. It's a time when basic body shape is determined. The 14-day embryo rule is based on the day 15 emergence of a primitive streak around which the symmetry of the human body begins to take shape. Before this point, an embryo can be split into identical multiples, so the streak's appearance is considered a rough approximation for an embryo's identity as an individual. But in a commentary on the new research published in Nature, experts argue there's room for the rule to be reconsidered. The 14-day rule was never intended to be a bright line denoting the onset of moral status in human embryos, they wrote. Rather, it's a public policy tool designed to carve out space for scientific inquiry and simultaneously show respect for diverse views. The writers of the op-ed don't argue that the rule should be tossed out immediately now that it's possible for the scientists to break it. In fact, they caution that changes to these laws could cause moral outcry against important stem cell research and the development of better in vitro fertilization techniques. Abortion opponents have already spoken out against the studies, but commentary writers believe the potential scientific achievements, like allowing scientists to study all aspects of early human development with unprecedented precision, warrant discussion. Longer cultures could provide absolutely critical information for basic human biology, Getz said, but this would kind of raise the next question: where should we put the next limit? In a statement given to the nonprofit Genetic News Expert Service, Biosciences Director Henry Greeley expressed skepticism over the scientific value of extending this limit. If we do not use a 14-day rule, what limit will we use? 12 weeks or so, as in many Europe abortion laws. Viability, around 23 weeks in U.S. abortion law. Human development is a seamless process, but ultimately lines need to be drawn, especially when they do not naturally exist, Greeley wrote. I do not see a politically, or for most people, morally acceptable line after 14 days. Given the questionable scientific value of the research, no case has been made for changing it, he said. University of California's Peter Donovan, a professor of biological chemistry and developmental cell biology, pointed out that the development period opened up by extending the 14-day limit has until now largely remained a black box. Perhaps we could begin to understand the consequences of fetal alcohol syndrome, study the potential causes of autism, and find out why some environmental chemicals can affect development, he said. Perhaps we might, for example, be able to more quickly understand what the Zika virus does, or what it does to embryos to cause major problems with development. There could be major benefits for society if the 14-day limit is crossed. Then society has to fully understand the science and come to an informed decision about the use of technology, Donovan wrote.
Ken Schultz writes in the New York Times from Nepal about after tragedies, Nepal hopes for an uneventful year for Everest. 11,000 feet above sea level, Jules Mountain, age 49, a British investor, proposed a toast to the summit, he said, raising a pint at Cafe Daphne Bar, a popular gathering spot here along the trek to Everest's South Base Camp. Christophe de Blois, age 36, a Belgian salesman, joined in with a cup of tea. It's going to be a good year, said Mr. de Blois, who was back to make a third attempt to climb Everest after his last expedition was canceled in 2014. Mr. Mountain added, if it's not a good year, things are going to be dire, as climbing teams made sorties up Everest's lowest slopes in April. A network of guides, Sherpas, and mountaineers offered anxious predictions for the spring season. After 2 years of tragedy, a drop in climbing numbers this year, and a confluence of safety concerns, much is at stake. In April 2014, an avalanche on the south side of the mountain killed 16, passing through the Kuma icefall, a stretch of ice towers strung with ropes and ladders. Then last April, a series of earthquakes killed nearly 9,000 people, including at least 18 at the South Base Camp. In response to both events, climbing expeditions were canceled. Last year, for the first time since 1974, not a single climber reached the summit of Everest. Climate agencies have taken upbeat tones this year, noting that numbers typically rebound after major disasters. But in Bizarre, the drop in demand is appreciable, with around 290 climbers attempting Everest's south side of the ascent so far this spring, down from 357 in the same time period in 2015. The Sherpas Sherpas who often serve as high altitude guides complain of fewer tours, fewer jobs, and fewer choices. Many lodges, once chronically crammed, now run under capacity. Western climbing agencies, typically well represented on Everest, have struggled to fill teams. Some have offered discounts for returning climbers, while others have canceled teams entirely. The vacuum has been filled by lower cost Nepalese operators. In a recent dispatch from base camp, Alan Arnett, an American climbing specialist, said he could not recognize many of the names written across expedition tents. I've been predicting that the locals would take over Everest, and based on this walkthrough, the transition is well underway, given that many longtime Western operators have their usual clients and some are not here at all. As the unofficial capital of Nepal's region, which has 3 of the world's 10 tallest mountains, Nepal Bazaar offers a range of travel experiences from budget rooms partitioned with plywood to a secluded Japanese resort where on a clear day, guests have majestic views of Everest. Here, lodges promise Finnish saunas and organic coffee sold for Western prices. Across a steep hillside for a couple of dollars, visitors can enter a Buddhist monastery housing what local residents say is the skull of a Yeti. Mr. Mountain, a British property investor, said the choice to shift to a lower cost agency was an easy one. After losing the $65,000 he paid in 2015 for a Western-led expedition that was canceled and not refunded, Mr. Mountain has decided instead to climb with a Nepalese agency that typically charges $35,000. He said he was prepared to forego some of the comforts included in a more expensive package. I was offered jacuzzis and swimming pools and saunas. He said it was all about the money last year. Mr. Dubois, the Belgian salesman, was also turned away from Everest in 2014 when the expedition he had paid $50,000 for was canceled after the avalanche along the Khumbu icefall. Only $800 was refunded. The experience, he said, was so frustrating that he opted for a cheaper Nepalese agency this season. Nepalese agencies, he said, are getting a better reputation.
From the World Herald in Silicon Valley, where vulnerable unicorn startups are commonplace, the most mythical creature of all is the Trump supporter. Sam Altman, president of startup accelerator Y Combinator, said he supported Republicans in the past, but Trump, no, obviously not. He said it seems to be the end of the Republican Party. He plans to vote for Democrat Hillary Clinton this time. Republicans usually stay pretty quiet in tech circles, but this year it's the next level in terms of how discreet people are being, said Tucker Bounds, a startup founder and former deputy communications director for John McCain's failed presidential campaign in 2008. Bounds has not decided who to vote for and said other candidates may emerge. Chris Sacca, an early investor in Twitter and Uber, said he knew 0 Trump supporters in Silicon Valley. Hunter Walk, another venture capitalist, said, no, not even the folks I suspect. San Francisco Republican Party and Santa Clara Republican Party did not name any tech industry Trump supporters when asked on Thursday. One industry insider forwarded a long email chain to Bloomberg News with executives discussing Trump's victory. It included several Silicon Valley Republicans, none of whom wrote anything to support the candidate. Some Trump policies turn off the technology industry. Free trade deals and open immigration are popular in Silicon Valley, and Trump has made building a wall between Mexico and the U.S. a centerpiece of his campaign, while criticizing trade deals struck by Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. We all very strongly believe in immigration and bringing very skilled, awesome people to the U.S. and welcoming them, said George Arison, CEO of startup Shift Technologies, who immigrated from Georgia at age 14. He declined to say who he supports, adding, Google wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Russian-born Sergey Brin, and Tesla wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Elon Musk, who comes from South Africa. A lack of support in Silicon Valley may not worry Trump because it's lean Democrat anyway, along with most California national elections. Beyond this liberal echo chamber, he has more support, according to Nancy McIntyre, CEO startup of Fingerprint, who traveled recently to cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore to meet customers. There were a number of really educated business people who were supporting Trump, and their perspective was, Washington is totally screwed up and we need an outsider, said McIntyre, who herself supports Clinton. You go out into the world and that's what you see, she said. However, as technology companies such as Google and Facebook have grown into some of the world's most valuable businesses, the sector has become a lobbying powerhouse and more of a political force. And employees at some Silicon Valley companies lean more Republican than their neighbors. As the presidential race got rolling last year, employees from Intel, Oracle, Cisco, and others gave most dollars to Republican candidates in their party. That was, though, before Trump won. Reince Priebus, chairman of the Republican National Committee, called for unity after Trump won Tuesday's Indiana primary, a victory that drove his two remaining opponents out from the race. Republicans in Silicon Valley seem reluctant so far. After Cruz dropped out on Tuesday, the tweets of venture capitalist Republican supporter Keith Rabois took a sour turn. Nixon feels like a flawless politician by comparison, he wrote. As the baseball people say, the GOP strategy is now pray for rain. Andrew Barkett, the former chief technology officer of the Republican Party who's worked for Google and Facebook, wrote a lengthy Facebook post that called people who support Trump delusional. We're going to somehow save this country and the party. I don't know how, he wrote, but I'm not going to succumb to a world in which Donald Trump becomes an acceptable option. So far, Bach CEO Levy in Silicon Valley said Silicon Valley was keeping its cool about the potential for a Trump presidency. We're hopeful and optimistic the country is ultimately rational and that for the primary process is not a reflection of the national view.
Rod Norland and Jawaz Khan write in the New York Times from Kabul, Afghanistan, about Taliban execute two women. Taliban insurgents publicly executed two women, one of them in an apparent honor killing in northern Afghanistan recently, according to Afghan officials, members of the victims' families, in a video posted online. The killings, which were thought to be unrelated, took place in recent months in northern Jasham province and predominantly Uzbek area where Taliban presence has traditionally been weak among ethnic platoons. The killings came to light after a video was circulated of one of them and officials discovered evidence of the other. In one of the cases, a pregnant 22-year-old woman named Rabia, a mother of two young children, was accused by her husband of adultery, tried and convicted by the Taliban on the spot, and then publicly shot 3 times. Members of her family said that her husband had concocted the adultery charge because of a land dispute between their families, and that he had wanted to inherit his wife's interest in the land. They buried her without even allowing her family to participate in her funeral, says Shakira, her aunt, who, like many Afghans, has only one name. I know she was a very innocent woman, Shakira said, speaking by telephone from her home in the provincial capital. She did not have the heart to be unfaithful. Another motive for the Taliban to kill her, Shakira said, was that 2 of Rivera's uncles were militia commanders loyal to the Uzbek leader, Abdul Dasan, who is also first vice president of Afghanistan. According to the deputy police chief, Hafsi, the apparent honor killing took place in Mendlik village in the district of Faizabad. The district governor of Faizabad, who is one of Afghanistan's few female governors, said it had been personally carried out by the Taliban shadow governor in the district, whom she identified as Kerry Wassol. The executions were reminiscent of similar executions carried out frequently from 1996 to 2001, when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan and killed many women convicted of so-called moral crimes by shooting them in the head at the National Stadium before large crowds. In rural areas where the group holds sway, they have often stoned women to death for suspected moral offenses. In the second execution case, is believed to have taken place 4 months ago, though the video surfaced only in the past couple of days. The victim is seen in a blue burqa sitting on the ground. A Taliban court convicted her of killing her husband, whose family crowded around the execution site and loudly voted to execute her. The victim's identity was not known, but Colonel Hafsi said that the authorities believe that the video was genuine and that the execution had taken place in the Kankat district. The executioner's face is covered, but he was believed to be the district's Taliban commander. The children of Rabir, the victim in the suspected honor killing, were not present when the Taliban officially summarily executed her in the yard of her home. But according to Shakira, Rivera's 3-year-old daughter found her mother's bloody sandals after the killings and recognized them. She ran to her grandma asking, "Where is her mother?" Shakira said. The grandmother did not have an answer for her. Rivera's 6-month-old son had still been breastfeeding at the time his mother was killed, Shakira said. And members of the family say they have been unable to afford enough powder baby formula for the infant. Both children remained with the father's family.
From the World Herald, and also speaking of politics, Donald Trump is the presumptive presidential nominee, but Republicans in Nebraska will still have a chance to have their voices heard in this year's wild GOP presidential battle. On Tuesday, Nebraskans go to the polls and cast ballots for presidential candidates on both sides of the ticket, along with deciding who will advance in the GOP congressional contest between Don Bacon and Chip Maxwell in Omaha's 2nd District. For Republicans, the primary comes a week after Trump essentially sewed up the GOP nomination, yet there will still be 4 other names on the ballot: Ted Cruz, John Kasich, and Marco Rubio, as well as Ben Carson. Most Republicans expect Nebraskans to rally around the likely GOP standard bearer, but others say some protest votes might be launched. I definitely think we'll see some of that, said Randy Atkins, political scientist at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And we may see some drop off at the top of the ballot, so with Republicans refusing to vote for any of the presidential candidates, he said. For Democrats, their presidential vote will also amount to nothing more than a big state survey. Both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are on the ballot, but Sanders already won a majority of Nebraska's national delegates. Democrats chose this year to divvy up their delegates in March caucuses, which Sanders won, but state law still requires the candidates' names to be on a primary ballot. Besides the presidential and congressional races, Nebraska's ballot will contain plenty of local primary contests. Half of the Nebraska legislature will be selected this year, as well as numerous board members for counties, schools, and other local governments. Some bond issues might also be decided. Still, this year's primary is shaping up to be a low-key affair. State Republicans had visions of capturing a little presidential limelight this year and dreamed, at least until last week, that all 3 remaining GOP candidates might stump in their state. But when Trump won Indiana last Tuesday, those hopes were dashed. Cruz and Kasich quickly dropped out, leaving only Trump. Trump held a rally in Omaha on Friday, but Cruz canceled his planned trip to Nebraska. Statewide turnout is expected to be about 25% of registered voters. Many local Republicans and political observers now expect Trump to win the primary, even though the prevailing wisdom heading into the primary had been that Nebraska was Cruz territory. The belief stemmed from the fact that Cruz did well in neighboring states such as Kansas and Iowa. I think people are pretty much resigned to the fact that Trump is going to be the nominee, said Paul Landau, a political scientist at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I think for many Nebraskans, that's not such a bad thing. He's conservative and appears to have the possibility of winning. And while he may not have been their first choice, they will unite behind him, said Landau, who himself is a Democrat and worked for a Democratic mayor in Omaha. The sudden end of the GOP primary highlights one interesting element of play in politics, the early ballot. David Kramer, a former chairman of the Nebraska Republican Party, noted that many voters had already cast their ballots in the state before Cruz dropped out. Kramer said, however, he thought Trump would likely have won Nebraska even if Cruz hadn't exited the race. Although the presidential races on the ballot in Nebraska will not count for much, Republican voters in the 2nd District will get to decide which candidate will challenge Democrat Brad Ashford in the November election. It's a race that pits Don Bacon, a political newcomer who's been embraced by many of the GOP officials, against Chip Maxwell, a longtime Omaha Republican with strong ties to the local Tea Party movement. It's also a race that has captured national attention. The congressional arm of the National Democratic Party poured $430,000 into television ads in the Omaha market. The ad hammered Bacon as the establishment candidate while essentially touting Maxwell's conservative credentials. Atkins said the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee ads show that it believes Bacon, a retired brigadier general, would be a far greater challenge to Ashford in the fall. What it tells us is the Democratic Party nationally views this as their top seat, Atkins said. Landau said he doesn't believe that money or their efforts will decide the race. He believes it has the potential to backfire among Republican voters in the district. The DCCC can hardly control what goes on in the Republican primary, Landau said. It can try, but it usually doesn't work. In the legislature, 25 of the 49 seats are on the ballot, although only 13 races have 3 or more candidates. Two of the most watched legislative races are not in competitive primaries, but they could have a huge impact in the state capitol. State Senators Les Seiler of Hastings and Al Davis of Hyannis are both Republicans and have been drawing challenges from fellow Republicans, one of whom clearly has the support of Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts. Seiler and Davis both angered Ricketts by voting to override his vetoes last year on the gas tax and the death penalty appeal. Ricketts supports Seiler's challenger, Steve Halloran of Hastings, and while the governor said through a spokesman he does not have any involvement in Davis's race, if Seiler or Davis gets less than 50% of the vote in the primary, he would be considered vulnerable to defeat. Landau said the two races pose some political risks and benefits for Ricketts. If Seiler and Davis end up trailing their challengers in the primary, Ricketts' influence in the legislature may be strengthened. It's a big risk for the governor, Landau said. If his candidates win the primary, then he obviously looks great. But if the incumbents win, he looks like he's out of control, and it's kind of amateurish.
Robert McFadden writes in the New York Times about D.W. Duncan, age 79, a Vietnam veteran, the critic dies. Donald Duncan, a Green Beret Master Sergeant who came home from Vietnam, a disillusioned hero in 1965, and became a leading early opponent of the war, died in the obscurity of a small Midwestern town 7 years ago, an all but forgotten soldier. He was 79. In an age of seemingly information ubiquity, the news media will generally recall the lives of noteworthy people when they die. But Mr. Duncan's death went largely unnoticed outside of Madison, Indiana, the Ohio River town where he lived. His obituary in the Madison Courier said only that Mr. Duncan had once worked for a local nonprofit that helped poor people find jobs. The crucial events of his life, the killings and brutalities of 18 months in Vietnam, the agony of conscience and conversation, and the years of anti-war struggle had happened long ago and were not mentioned. Mr. Duncan's daughters, Valerie Casey and Lucy Wilson, confirmed last week that he died on March 25th, 2009 at a Madison nursing home. In America torn by protest against the war in the late 1960s and early 70s, Mr. Duncan was often in the news, although not as prominently as the pediatrician Dr. Benjamin Spock, the Roman Catholic priest Daniel and Philip Berrigan, or the actress Jane Fonda, who was photographed laughing and applauding on an anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi. Daniel Berrigan died on April 30th. But in 1966, well before the Tet Offensive and the My Lai massacre stirred national discontent, Mr. Duncan was one of the first returning veterans to portray the war as a moral quagmire that had little to do with fighting the spread of communism as American leaders were portraying it. Sergeant Duncan, who went to war convinced it was an anti-communist crusade, ended his special forces duty a changed man. A 10-year veteran, he rejected an offer of an officer's commission and left the Army. Back home, he became a fierce critic of the war, writing articles and a memoir and speaking at rallies across the country with the singer Joan Baez, the writer Norman Mailer, and the comedian Dick Gregory. In a 1966 cover article for Ramparts, a radicalized Roman Catholic political and literary journal, Mr. Duncan told of witnessing murders, torture, other atrocities by American forces in Vietnam in violation of all international laws, of refusing orders at an Aceh to kill 4 enemy prisoners whose hands were tied behind them, and of rapes by South Vietnamese troops that were never reported, let alone published. The whole thing was a lie, Mr. Duncan wrote. We weren't preserving freedom in South Vietnam. There was no freedom to preserve. To voice opposition to the government meant jail or death. Neutralism was forbidden and punished. Newspapers that didn't say the right thing were closed down. People are not even free to leave. And Vietnam is one of those rare countries that doesn't fill its America visa quota. In 1967, Mr. Duncan joined the Reverend Coffin Jr., Dr. Spock, David Dillinger, and other leaders of the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam to plan and carry out huge protest rallies in New York, Washington, San Francisco, and dozens of other cities at which draft cards and American flags were burned and protesters clashed with the police. Mr. Duncan also testified that year at an unofficial war crimes tribunal tribunal organized by the philosopher Bertrand Russell in Denmark, and at South Carolina court-martial where he spoke in defense of Captain Levy, a Green Beret who had also turned against the war. Captain Levy was convicted of disobeying orders and attempted to incite disloyalty and eventually served 26 months in prison. 1968, Mr. Duncan, then the military editor of Ramparts, helped Mr. Dellinger, Mr. Gregory, Rainey Davis, and other anti-war leaders plan protest at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The rallies and the marches drew tens of thousands of protesters and led to hundreds of arrests and injuries, and to a circus-like trial of 8 protest leaders on inciting to riot charges. In his Ramparts article and a memoir, The New Legions, 1967, Mr. Duncan detailed a military career that began in December 1954 when he was drafted by the Army in Rochester, 24-year-old American who had been born in Canada and raised by a stepfather of Hungarian origin. I was a militant anti-communist, Mr. Duncan wrote in Ramparts. Like most Americans, I couldn't conceive of anybody choosing communism over democracy. The depths of my aversion to this ideology was, I suppose, due in part to my being Roman Catholic and in part to stories in the news media about communism. My stepfather was born in Budapest, Hungary, although he had come to the United States as a young man. Most of his family stayed in Europe. Mr. Duncan was serving with an artillery unit in Germany in 1956 when the Soviet Union crushed a Hungarian revolt. He recalled being frustrated and angry when the United States did not intervene. He joined the Special Forces in 1961. I was so impressed with their dedication. He said their anti-communism bordered on fanaticism. Special Forces training, he said, included methods of torture to extract information, including the delicate operation of lowering a man's testicles into a jeweler's vice. He said he later witnessed the use of such techniques in Vietnam. He volunteered to fight in South Vietnam in 1964 and served in missions all over the country with the 5th Special Forces Group. He killed the enemy, saw comrades killed, watched civilians shoot and bayonet, and their villages burned. He was awarded South Vietnam Silver Star, the United States Army Air Medal, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Combat Infantry badge, and was recommended for a Silver Star and the Legion of Merit. On reconnaissance in Laos, where United States bombers were pounding an enemy supply route, he began to doubt American reports on the war. This mission confirmed that the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so-called, and the traffic on it, was grossly exaggerated, he said, and that the Viet Cong were getting the bulk of their weapons from ARVN and by sea. It also was one of more pieces of evidence that the Viet Cong were primarily South Vietnamese, not imported troops from the north. The ARVN was South Vietnam's army. Mr. Duncan said it had been common knowledge that draft dodging and desertion rates among South Vietnamese troops were staggering, and the Viet Cong guerrillas attacked American machine gun positions across open terrain with terrible losses. American propaganda, he said, could not obscure such lopsided motivations. Even during the short period I'd been in Vietnam, he wrote, the Viet Cong had obviously gained in strength. The government controlled less and less of the country every day. The more troops and money we poured in, the more people hated us. He concluded that America was destined to lose the war. I don't think Vietnam will be better off under Ho's brand of communism, he said, but it's not for me or my government to decide. That decision is for the Vietnamese. I also know that we have allowed the creation of a military monster that will lie to our elected officials, and that both of them will lie to the American public.
From the Lincoln Journal-Star, shortly after 3 p.m. on Saturday, hundreds of people gathered as close to the runway as possible to see the stars of Lincoln's Guardians of Freedom air show, the Blue Angels. The pilots got in their respective planes, but it looked like they were about to take off. An announcement came overhead. Due to weather conditions, the Blue Angels will not be performing today. We're sorry for the inconvenience. Shouts of frustration and anger could be heard as people made their way out of Air Park. When Sue Lakowitz first heard the announcement, she thought it was a joke. I thought they just told us that to see how everybody would react, she said. She said it looked like the show was just getting started. She brought her 5- and 8-year-old grandchildren, hoping they could see the performance. Michael Wendell, a private pilot from Grant, said he couldn't blame them for canceling the show. Between the smoke coming in from Canada and the wind, he said the conditions were bad. The air show went from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Saturday and will do so again today. The free event is an educational experience even for the most seasoned aviator. People had many avenues to learn about various types of aircraft, food tents, and other activities stretched down the runway. Those who arrived early jockeyed for positions to set up lawn chairs and picnic blankets to watch military planes of all shapes and sizes do flips, spins, and dives. Wahoo resident Tashua Picarni said the appeal of the air show was the ability to enjoy it with her family. There's a lot to do down here, lots of different things to see, lots of things our boys like, Picarni said. We live outside of Wahoo in the country, and we have military helicopters fly over our house all the time, and our boys just love that. As for the self-described military brat John Barrett, seeing the wide variety of planes and military equipment felt a little bit like home. He used to work at Duncan Aviation. I've been going to air shows since I was in a stroller, Barrett said. I just have a love of airplanes. Some people didn't just come for the planes, though. Eric Nelson founded Precision Exotics 3 years ago with the hope of reaching car enthusiasts nationwide by traveling with the air show. Nelson has a Ferrari and a Lamborghini that travel with his company. For $100, the average person can drive these $200,000 cars for a few minutes and experience an exhilarating ride. Nelson said, aircraft enthusiasts and car enthusiasts are separated by just about a chromosome, Nelson said, so pretty much everyone out here is interested in this. After the Blue Angels show didn't happen, people flocked to Precision Exotics. Ezra Puchala, who's 12, and his brother Levi, 10, both rode in the Lamborghini. It was awesome, Levi said. I put my hands up the whole time. Staff Sergeant Brennan DeFazio of Virginia Beach, Virginia, said her favorite part of the air show is watching people's reactions when they learn more about the military and see a demonstration of what they do. My favorite part of the air show is really connecting with people and showing what our military does, DeFazio said. In addition to entertainment, air shows like today's are a critical time for recruitment, she said. The Air Force recruits not only nationwide, but even in places like Canada, Dubai, and Korea. Our mission is a dual purpose, first being to demonstrate air power, DeFazio said, but number two is to kind of recruit and get our next generation of airmen into the Air Force. More than anything, though, DeFazio hopes the public can connect with their military, especially now that there's so much turmoil in the U.S. with politics and whatnot. It's so nice just to be out here and demonstrate to these people that this is our air power, and this is what we do, and this is what we provide, DeFazio said.
Jim Robbins writes in the New York Times about the grizzly at a crossroads. Yellowstone National Park is where this article is written, in Wyoming. When the Yellowstone grizzly bear was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, there were only about 100 to 200 of them in a park in the surrounding country. The main culprit in their decline was, oddly, garbage. Bears raiding dumpsters in a campground or, say, lapping up bacon grease behind an outfitter's tent were often shot as scary nuisances. A 35-year campaign to clean up dumps and bear-proof garbage cans and teach people to keep picnic baskets and coolers in the car has had a significant payoff. There were 717 grizzlies at last count in the 20 million acres in and around Yellowstone National Park. Still, the bears have all but disappeared from almost all the continental United States except for Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks and a few other slivers of habitat. All told, there are about 1,800 in the lower 48 states. One reason for the overall decline is that they have the lowest reproductive rate of any mammal in North America besides humans. Sows have their first cubs at 5 to 8 years of age and space them 3 years apart. Just 1 in 3 cubs survives to adulthood. A grizzly lives about 30 years on average. Now, scientists are at a crossroads. Some biologists say that the grizzlies' numbers are robust and it's time to remove the most stringent protections for the bears, delisting them under the Species Act, which, among other consequences, means they would probably be hunted again for sport. That prospect disturbs even those in favor of lifting the restrictions. Citing the grizzlies' recovery in the wild country and around Yellowstone, the Fish and Wildlife Service tried to delist the bear in 2007. Environmentalists sued, and a federal court forced officials to redo an analysis of the future of the whitebark pine tree, whose nuts are an important food for the bears. The trees' numbers have declined widely as the climate in the Rocky Mountains has warmed, and tree-killing insects are taking a steep toll. Nevertheless, federal biologists say the plan to manage the grizzly after delisting is adequate, but lifting protections is still a hotly contested proposition. If delisting is completed this time, perhaps as soon as the end of the year, park officials will continue to manage the bears within Yellowstone's 2.2 million acres, where they will essentially remain protected. But in a rugged wild country around the park, the Fish and Wildlife Service would turn over management of the bears to the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. That would probably mean a return to the hunting of for grizzlies for sports in those states. Kerry Gunther, a biologist who heads the bear management program at Yellowstone, says he favors delisting a bear, but although he is a hunter, Dr. Gunther says he cannot imagine shooting a grizzly. Each bear is an individual. He said they are highly intelligent, but sympathy for the grizzlies is often accompanied by fear. The big bears, males range up to 700 pounds, and females up to 400, occasionally attack humans. Last year, a hiker in Yellowstone was killed by a sow with 2 cubs. With delisting, there would be a limit on total grizzly deaths a year in the Yellowstone ecosystem, which would include everything from hunting to bears hit by a car or dispatched by biologists. If numbers drop below 600 in the ecosystem, discretionary mortalities will be halted, including hunting. Critics say that delisting would put the big bears at risk and that it is being done for political, not scientific reasons. Many Westerners oppose the federal authority represented by the Endangered Species Act. Some ranchers say bears are preying on their herds more frequently, and some hunters are eager for a trophy. But the grizzly population is lower than federal officials believe and is dwindling, according to David Matson, a retired wildlife biologist who has analyzed federal data. The delisting proposal has also given short shrift to the effects of warming and drier weather, he said. The ecosystem is unraveling because of climate change and will continue to do so as temperatures grow warmer. The decline of key bear foods like trout, pine nuts, and elk means the population may continue to drop, Dr. Matson said. Why rush with a decision to delist when all indicators are of a population that is vulnerable and positioned to decline even more than what they already have, he said. Other researchers argue that the grizzlies are likely to prove resilient to climate change. Studies show that the bears are wide range, eating everything from ladybugs and moss to earthworms, plant roots, grass, and wild berries. If they lose one food source, Dr. Gunther said, they will switch to another. Bears are better adapted to deal with climate change than a lot of other species, he said. They once ranged from Alaska to the arid regions of Mexico.
From the World Herald, they call themselves vintage activists for the environment. And when members of 100 Grannies for a Livable Future needed advice on how to fight a proposed oil pipeline in their home state of Iowa, they contacted Bold, Nebraska. We knew we could turn to you to help us fight the pipeline because you guys are the experts, said Miriam Kashia of North Liberty, Iowa. The Keystone XL oil pipeline, once proposed to run through Nebraska and other states, gave rise to the progressive activist organization and its leader, Jane Cleave. Now that the pipeline is defeated, some of her opponents probably hoped she would move on to another national issue, preferably on one of the coasts. While Cleave has no plans to leave Nebraska, her organization, though, is on the move. She will manage an umbrella group that's launched chapters in Iowa, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. While Cleave will transition out of the day-to-day operations of Bold, Nebraska, she plans to remain in Hastings, where she lives with her husband, Scott, and 3 daughters. She wants to focus on fighting big fossil fuel projects and trying to pass legislation to outlaw eminent domain for private development. And while she would still like to run for elected office, she's putting that, though, in the someday category. In the meantime, the group she founded will continue its work in the state. In recent months, Bold, Nebraska has criticized a law passed by Nebraska lawmakers to allow packers to own hogs, and it's helped organize opponents of a proposed chicken processing plant near Fremont. A Florida native who once headed the Young Democrats of America, she first came to Nebraska to help organize the 3rd congressional House race of Democrat Scott Cleave. The two married after his 2006 run, which, though he lost, was still the best showing by a Democrat in the district in decades. Jane Cleve then emerged as the director of Change That Works Nebraska, an effort to pressure then Senator Ben Nelson to vote for healthcare reform. Cleve envisioned an organization that would elbow its way into conversations about the state's policies. Dick Holland was sold, and the pitch by the plucky 5'5" woman with sharp elbows made a difference. She has no reluctance to step into a battle, he said. Bold, Nebraska officially launched in March of 2010. A couple of months later, the course of the fledgling organization would change when Cleve attended a State Department hearing in New York about a proposed Canadian oil pipeline. Cleve was impressed by the passion and intelligence she heard from farmers and ranchers who testified against the project. She recognized that protecting private land and clean water were issues that could appeal to politically independent and conservative landowners in ways that more traditional environmental causes could not. Cleve joined forces with national environmental groups to apply pressure on President Barack Obama. She also built alliances with Native American groups working to protect tribal lands. And like a rancher with hot iron, she stamped Bold, Nebraska's brand on apparel, yard signs, social media, and even a stage of a Neil Young, Willie Nelson protest concert that attracted 8,000 people to a Northeast Nebraska farm. She called the events grassroots actions. They became the hallmark of her approach. Some critics considered them gimmicks. Some of her foes in the Keystone XL battle conceded they grudgingly respected her ability to focus the opposition. She succeeded in stoking people's emotions to fuel a leftist center fight, said Chris Peterson of Lincoln, a conservative campaign and public relations consultant who worked for the pro-pipeline group. In response, Cleve said renewable energy projects such as wind and solar also create jobs. Bold, Nebraska is categorized as a 501c4 social welfare organization, which makes it exempt from federal tax. Donations to such groups are not tax deductible, though, so groups do not have to disclose their donors. Nonetheless, Cleve supplied a listing of Bold, Nebraska's major donors, which has expanded since Holland supplied the seed money. Among the supporters are New Venture Fund in Washington, D.C., Cloud Mountain Foundation in New York, David Desjardins, one of the first software engineers at Google, and many others. The reports indicates Cleve's salary was about $100,000 in 2014. Now she's going to see if she can duplicate her success in other states. The umbrella organization is Bold Alliance, and Cleve will be its president. I knew if we just stayed in Nebraska, our fundraising abilities would be limited to a small population of donors, she said. So what we've done is brought that model to other states fighting not only oil pipelines, but other risky fossil fuel projects. In Louisiana, for example, that means opposing offshore drilling and helping low-income communities faced with challenges related to climate change. In Oklahoma, it's raising awareness of earthquakes linked to fracking. In Iowa, the group opposes the Bakken pipeline and is pushing the state's attorney general to join an effort to punish Exxon for ignoring scientific evidence on global warming. Cleve said the organization is also providing advice to landowner groups fighting oil pipelines in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Virginia, and West Virginia. Zach Pollitt, a national campaign director for a network, said his organization was impressed with what Cleve was able to do during the long battle over the Keystone XL. Bold, Nebraska engaged farmers, ranchers, and tribes. Pollitt said, to us, it seemed like the right thing to do. Holland, who decided to give Cleve a chance to start her own organization years ago, said he's pleased with the direction she's taking it. I hope it makes a hell of a lot of people mad, and I hope they start thinking about the future, he said. Amy Schaefer of North Platte will take over as the new director of Bold, Nebraska. Cleve admitted she's having a hard time letting go. I'm happiest when I'm in a room full of farmers and ranchers. She said, I like the way they think. They're incredibly reliable.
Well, Melina Wallen writes about how to make our citizens arrest in the New York Times Magazine. There are very strict rules of engagement, says Jeremy McHenry, who owns a private security firm in California, has made over 1,000 citizens arrests. Statutes governing when and how lay people can arrest their compatriots vary. Know your state laws. In California, you must witness the crime in order to make an arrest for a misdemeanor. For a felony, you don't. McHenry likes to play it safe and always tell his new security guard trainees, if you didn't see it, it didn't happen. Say you witness a man snatching a woman's purse. You're inclined to intervene, assess your safety. Is he bigger than you? Might he have a weapon? Is it always better to be a good witness than to botch an arrest, thereby endangering yourself and further complicating an unfolding crime? If you do get involved, act with authority. Speak in a stern, matter fact voice, Henry says, announce loudly, "You're under citizen's arrest. Decide ahead of time whether you intend to restrain the person." Most states allow for the use of necessary force for all but one of McHenry's citizens' arrest. He was on the job, either in security or looking for shoplifters in department stores, and he handcuffed perpetrators. The one arrest he made in his free time involved holding a belligerent man down on the floor of a truck stop restaurant until the sheriffs arrived. Expect people to run, resist, punch, and kick. I've been hit in the head with a bottle of alcohol, he says. Well,
Interesting.
yeah, and face lawsuits as well.
Yeah.
Let's turn to the death and funeral notices for today, May 8th. Adams Thomas, age 88, and services are not listed. Breeling James, age 78, services are at the Arbor Cremation Society, 2819 South 125th Avenue. Campbell David, age 70, services are in Missouri Valley, Iowa, at the Hennessy Funeral Home. Sadisky Barbara, age 87, services are at the Bremen Mortuary, 1702 North 72nd Street. Clary Carolyn, age 74, memorials are suggested to Stonecraft Ministries, Youth for Christ, or Navigators. Services will be at the Bremen Mortuary, 1702 North 72nd Street. Culetta Melina, age 91, memorials are suggested to St. Thomas More Catholic Church. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Diagasta Edward, age 92, services are at the West Lawn Mortuary, 5701 Center Street. Draculich Ronald, age 69, and services are not listed. Dyer Adeline, age 92, memorials are suggested to Domestic Women's Crisis Center or to St. Wenceslas Catholic Church or to Masses. Services are in Wahoo, Nebraska at the Sabota Funeral Home. Flynn Patricia, age 65. Memorials are suggested to St. Francis de Sales Catholic School, Houston, Texas, St. Patrick's Catholic School, Elkhorn, Nebraska, or to St. Clementine Catholic School in Papillion. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Graff Marjorie, age 91. Memorials are suggested to the Agnes Robinson Wardley Library. Services are at the Reichlich Funeral Home, 21901 West Maple. Haywood Todd, age 48. Services are at the Bremen Mortuary, 6505 South 144th Street. Hiller Robert, age 93. Services are at the Reichlich Funeral Home, 21901 West Maple Road. Hilton Jean, age 71. Memorials to a memorial fund has been established. Services are in Glenwood, Iowa at the Los Hills Funeral and Cremation Center. Hughes John, age 76. Memorials to the Douglas County Health Center or to Creighton Prep. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 1010 North 72nd Street. Jensen Carmen, no age, no services listed. Jensen Glenn, age 87. Memorials to the family. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 1010 North 72nd Street. Keeler Peggy, age 91. Memorials are suggested to Nebraska Humane Society. Services are not listed. Kelly John, age 94. Services are not listed. Link James, age 75. Services are at the West Lawn Mortuary, 5701 Center Street. Lockhart William, age 88. Memorials are suggested to your favorite charity. Services are in Plattsmouth, Nebraska at the Roby Funeral Home. Luby Lester, age 84. Services are at the Bremen Mortuary, 1702 North 72nd Street. Again, Ellie, age 90. Services are at West Lawn Mortuary, 5701 Center Street. McIntosh Michael, age 39. Memorials are suggested to the family. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Motes Leola, age 95. Service memorials rather to Goldcrest Nursing Home in Adams, Nebraska. Services are at the Cutler O'Neill Mortuary, 545 Willow Avenue in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Monday, Richard, age 86, no services. Murphy Renee, memorials are suggested to the Duchesne Academy of Sacred Heart in Omaha, no services. North William, age 91, services are at Kaler Dose Mortuary, 441 North Washington Street in Papillion, Nebraska. Nusrela Carl, age 91, memorials to Mary R. Queen School. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Olson Wallace, age 82, memorials to the Humane Society or Food Bank of the Heartland. Services are at the Ragmick Funeral Home, 21901 West Maple Road. Paulson Dennis, age 69. Services are at John Gentleman Mortuary, 1010 North 72nd Street. Predole Betty, age 95. Memorials are suggested to charity of your choice. Services are in West Point, Nebraska at the Minnick Funeral Home. Rath Winford, age 85. Memorials to the family. Services are at West Lawn Mortuary, 5701 Center Street. Reimer Lowry, age 59. Services are in Council Bluffs, Iowa at the Cutler O'Neill Mortuary. Ross Maryland, age 72. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Runge Paul, age 95. Memorials to the family. Services are at the Rotor Mortuary, 11710 Standing Stone Drive. Schultz John, age 81. Services are at Bethany Funeral Home, 82nd and Harrison. Shanahan Lucille, age 94. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Shelton Joanne, age 82. Services are at Bethany Funeral Home, 82nd and Harrison. Smolensky Richard, age 90. Services are at the Korsky Larkin Stansowich Funeral Home, 5108 F Street. Stratman Marjorie, age 91. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 1010 North 72nd Street. Sullivan Carl, age 80. Services are in Papillion, Nebraska at the Kaler-Dos Mortuary. Tilly Stephen, age 65. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 3402 Sampson Way in Bellevue. Treader Lawrence, age 74. Services are at Rotor Mortuary, 2727 North 108th Street. White Ted, age 83. No services listed. Zank Elmer, age 90. Services are in Lincoln, Nebraska at the Lincoln Memorial Funeral Home, 6800 South 14th Street. We want to remind you that memorials to the Radio Talking Book Network are tax deductible. Will go a long way in keeping Radio Talking Book on the air. Please keep Radio Talking Book in mind when memorials are listed as donor's choice or your favorite charity. Donations should be sent to Radio Talking Book Network, 7101 Newport Avenue, Suite 205, Omaha, Nebraska, 68152. Thank you for being a Radio Talking Book Network listener and supporter. And we return you to Emily in the control room.
All right. Well, that brings us to the break. And I'm going to read you an article from the go over the main sections of Omaha World Herald, and it's a review. And overview, new Chinese restaurant Blue and Fly holds lots of familiar plus a few surprises. We recognize a lot of dishes on the menu at Blue and Fly, a new Chinese spot off the second street in Pacific Drive. There are people from Thai flavors and Chinese cuisine and lots of old school Americanized Chinese dishes from food. But what's really exciting about the little restaurant that opened on September is that it has a lot of dishes you won't recognize. Dishes that they likely never had before, and that's when things get fun. Owner Joe Cohen told me after my 3 visits that he decided on that menu, a mix of familiar and unfamiliar, for very specific reasons. He knew, after working for a number of years at his father's restaurant in Land Gardens, that he wanted to focus on what he called authentic Chinese food, dishes he grew up eating in China before he moved here at age 21, and dishes he'd eaten outside of Omaha in cities such as New York and Chicago. But he also knew that it was a risk in a city where many diners aren't yet familiar with food he was thinking of cooking. So he created a sort of hybrid of what people might know and what they might not. With the hope that American diners would come into his restaurant like they saw on his Americanized Chinese menu, and perhaps try something they never had before. In Omaha, we really lacked in this experience, he said, and I am like, hey, that's not fair. That's not fair to Omaha. We wanted to take the risk. It's a risk worth taking for diners, especially because he's hitting out of the park dishes such as mapo tofu, garlic spinach, and egg and tomato. An order of Chinese garlic spinach arrived, sizzling hot, rooted, and very garlicky. Spooned over white rice and a bit of its sauce, it hits the spot. The dumplings we tried that night came floating in a flavorful broth with wilted bok choy. Though the menu said the dumplings were supposed to be hot and spicy, ours were mild with a pleasantly slippery texture. We also wished for more spice in an order of kung pao chicken, although the version we tried arrived disappointingly mild. The vegetables in the dish were crisp, tender, and the chicken flavorful. Many of the dishes are ones I'll return for. That includes soft cooked scrambled eggs and stewed tomato with just a hint of sweetness in Blue and Fly's classic version of Chinese egg and tomato. A dish that might sound unusual, but it's the type of thing that's hard to quit eating once you begin. I'm already craving another hit of tingle-inducing Sichuan peppercorns, which appeared in 2 dishes, mapo tofu and fish cooked in chili oil. Loads of soft tofu filled the giant bowl of mapo tofu, along with bits of ground pork, peppercorns, and a dark fish sauce. The zingy peppercorns took center stage in another big bowl, this one with fish and vegetables cooked in hot chili oil. The bowl comes with a little mesh strainer on the side, which diners use to scoop out the tender, flavorful white fish and hunks of cream from underneath the surface of the broth. It is covered with crisp, hot red chili and peppercorns. It's a fun dish to eat, a beautiful one to look at, and my favorite of it has been my favorite at the restaurant. Head-on shrimp in the salt and pepper shrimp had a crisp yet spicy finish, and I also like the fish orders with fried tofu. And a cold chicken appetizer called soft buttered chicken was great, with tender roast meat and spicy adventure Sichuan sauce. I love this contrast in temperature on top of hot rice. The first dishes that I tried at the restaurant caramelized sweet potatoes, and which are listed on a Florida special next to the kitchen store. Colin didn't recognize me that afternoon. Came out after I ordered was a small bowl of room temperature water before he brought the dish. He showed me how to eat the super sweet baby potatoes. Each one was chopsticks and dipped the stretchy, sugary strings into the bowl of water, which breaks them off. Then toss a delightfully crisp tender, sweet flavors bite into your mouth. The chewy exterior crunches like a piece of peanut brittle that melts away, leaving notes of sweet, of spice, and sweet, along with the fluffy potato center. Good, absolutely singular, that too. If you couldn't tell, I really like the fly. I'm thrilled that Carl decided to open his restaurant over in Midtown because until now, all my favorite Chinese spots, including Canton House and Newport Mountain, have been west of 72nd Street. Midtowners and downtowners, along with the rest of the city, take note. There's a food experience waiting to be had. Get there. And this is, again, it's called Blue and Fly. It's Blue by 85th. Over at 721 South 72nd Street. You can call them at 402-544-6545. The website is blueandfly.com. And they're open from 5 to 10 p.m. Monday, Tuesday to Thursday, 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Friday and Saturday, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. And Sunday, noon to 10 p.m. The hits are excellent whitefish cooked in chili oil, double textured and creamy cake baked with Sichuan peppercorns, and classic mustard tofu had a spicy smoking tofu and minced bits of pork. This is an order of compound chicken and chicken mild. They have sauces, hot chicken beers. The prices are very reasonable. Both dishes are sized for sharing and between $10 and $15. And for the noise level, it's pretty quiet. A television set in the corner was the only sound outside of the seats by a diner. All right, well, that brings us to the end of your break. I want you to remember that this is your Radio Talking Book Network, your information network, serving Nebraska and its neighboring states. The Radio Talking Book Network is brought to you in cooperation from KIOS-FM in Omaha and statewide through the NET Radio Network. Well, since that brings the end of our break, I'm going to hand you on over back to your readers, and they're going to get right back on started with it for you.
Thank you, Emily. It's now time for the Public Pulse, letters to the editor off the opinion page of the Sunday World Herald. First, from Omaha, Ron Watton writes, "It's pathetic that just 4 years after the state of Nebraska allowed the Nebraska Tourism Commission to become independent, the agency basically does as it pleases. A few of the abuses were excessive spending on conference speakers and photo shoots, improperly reimbursing a contractor for alcohol and cigarettes, using the executive director's daughter in a state tourism advertising campaign, and paying excessive moving expenses for an employee. But those missteps are minor compared to letting an advertising contract go more than $4.4 million over budget. The tourism office has increased its budget by $1.6 million in just 3 years, and Director Kathy McKillop, without board approval, went to the state legislature for $750,000 in additional spending authority. Talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. My take is that the Tourism Commission should immediately be disbanded and proper penalties imposed on all who contributed to this taxpayer fraud." Don Nog of Omaha writes on the same topic, "I find myself smiling a little when reading about the Nebraska Tourism Commission and the auditor's report on it. I owned a business for 53 years, and I'm sure that if the Tourism Commission were one as well, the director would have been fired and possibly facing civil or even criminal charges. The director's excuse, one of many, is that the guidelines were not clear, and that's laughable. But this is government, so there will undoubtedly be a slap on the wrist. Some new guidelines will be written, and Governor Pete Ricketts will watch over it in his spare time." From Omaha, Mike Sotak writes, "A May 5th Public Pulse letter needs to be clarified. First, the Papio Missouri River Natural Resources District is not asking area taxpayers to continue funding its plan. Area taxpayers are asking Nebraskans to give NRDs the authority to issue bonds that will support their collective mission. Our state NRD's mission includes providing flood control, along with many other benefits that come from these projects: improvement to water quality, stream bank stabilization, wildlife habitat creation, and recreational opportunities. That is not mentioning ancillary benefits such as the well-documented improvement to property values. The letter acknowledged that the NRD plan may not make economic sense. Several studies have been prepared, including one my firm, Fira Engineering, worked on to show that these projects do, in fact, make economic sense. The reason the federal government is not supporting these projects has nothing to do with their economic feasibility. The Papio, Missouri River NRD has gone to great lengths to continuously update the Papillion Creek Watershed Partnership Plan for local efforts. Supporters of this plan, which include municipalities, citizens at large, outdoor enthusiasts, and the real estate and construction firms, are urging a vote for the plan. From Papillion, Catherine Townsend writes, "It's disappointing to see the World Herald's endorsement of the Papio, Missouri River Natural Resource District request to increase its bonding authority. Why spend millions of dollars on flood control when there are many less expensive ways for individuals, groups, and businesses to reduce flooding with wise planning and building and local capture of water?" On the prospect of the national election, from Omaha, Mark Kukler writes, House Speaker Paul Ryan's statement about not being ready to back presumptive Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump, "I think what is required is that we unify the party," is spot on. Trump's reaction, commenting that he isn't ready to back Ryan's agenda either, shows his childishness. It's frustrating to see the presumptive GOP candidate and potential future national role model acting like nothing more than a junior high school student council campaigner with poorly thought out retorts. Michael Lovejoy of Omaha writes, "The fiasco that was the GOP primary circus is over. Donald Trump will be running against Hillary Clinton. If you're angry your candidate didn't make it to the top spot in Cleveland, get over it, unless you wanted another 4 more years of President Obama's agenda. Republicans must be united and support Trump, even if some of them have to hold their noses to do it. We did it for John McCain in 2008 and Mitt Romney, and we can do it one more time." From Gibbon, Michael Costello writes, "With the exception of Nebraska Senator Ben Sass, who said he will not support Donald Trump in November, the majority of our state political leaders, such as Governor Pete Ricketts, Senator Deb Fischer, Representative Adrian Smith, and Omaha Mayor Gene Stothert, have lined up behind the likely Republican nominee. Trump has been divisive and sexist and used offensive rhetoric throughout the campaign, but these so-called leaders are ready to support him. Why? Smith released a statement saying he would support the GOP nominee in order to prevent a Hillary Clinton presidency. These politicians are spineless. Why can't they just say Donald Trump is not fit to be the Republican nominee now or in the future? It's no surprise that their approval ratings for doing their jobs is at an all-time low." And lastly, from Fullerton, Shar Parmentier writes, "I recently drove through Red Cloud, Nebraska, and purchased several of Willa Cather's books. There are other reminders of her legacy. For example, there is the May 4th World Herald story, 'Nephew of Cather left $5.8 million for UNL.' I sincerely hope the Nebraska schools still have her as a must-read." And there you have it, letters to the public pulse from the opinion page of today's Sunday World Herald.
In the business section of the New York Times, Rachel Abram writes from Johnstontown, New York, "We know it's weed, but is it kosher? The rabbis had never inspected a medical marijuana plant before. They had arrived here at Enviro Health of New York's plant about an hour northwest of Albany, looking for evidence that the company's products merited kosher certification. They would eventually give their approval, but not before asking some tough questions, beginning in a room where row after row of plants hung upside down to dry. This is where they start getting worried," recalled Ari Hunting, the company's chief executive, because the kosher rules they were most focused on apply after a plant is dry. As legalization of medical marijuana has hopscotched the nation, entrepreneurs have become nothing if not more imaginative. Marijuana lotions, gluten-free edibles, and many other niche products have hit the market. Businesses have also found resourceful ways to deal with a patchwork of taxation, banking, and interstate commerce issues. Little about the fledgling industry then comes as a surprise, but kosher pot? Well, business is business, whether it's widgets or weed, and any bit of competitive advantage is welcome. You're seeing companies looking for creative ways to distinguish themselves, but also just interesting ways to appeal to different types of consumers, said Taylor West, Deputy Director of the National Cannabis Industry Association. Vero, a subsidiary of Vero Health, is one of at least two companies aiming to sell kosher medical marijuana products like tinctures or cannabis oil. The Orthodox Union, one of the United States' most prominent Jewish groups, gave its first medical marijuana certificate to Vero in January. Another company, Cresco Labs in Illinois, is in the final stages of getting certification from a local organization. Vero's plants here looks like a prison and smells like a dorm. It used to be the site of the Tyrone Residential Center, a state-run facility for troubled youth that closed several years ago. The irony is not lost on Mr. Huffman or his workers. As he walked by old classrooms where hundreds of marijuana plants now grow, Mr. Huffman explained that the rabbis had mostly cared about what happened towards the end of the manufacturing process, which is why the drying plants had raised eyebrows. What chemicals did Vero use to extract the cannabis oil? The rabbis had needed to know. What kind of capsules did they use? Smoking marijuana by itself isn't an issue, at least not from a kosher dietary standpoint, since the rules are intended for food and drinks. Products ingested in some way, on the other hand, are another story. Ingredients must not come into contact with forbidden foods like pigs or insects, and the restrictions extend all the way down the supply chain. Every ingredient in a marijuana brownie, for example, needs to be kosher. The leaves, if eaten, would need to come from a bug-free plant. Marijuana gel caps cannot be made out of pig gelatin. There are also rules for the equipment that processes kosher food. Vero's products that have been certified by the Orthodox Union can have the recognizable OU stamp on their packaging and must submit to periodic inspections from the group's rabbis. We literally took them through every square inch of the facility, said David Ellis, the executive vice president of operations at Cresco Labs. The Chicago Council voted Cresco in March and said it was in the final stages of issuing a kosher certification that will cover everything from chocolate bars to concentrates. Life-saving medical treatment is an exception to kosher rules. A cancer drug made out of bacon-wrapped crickets, for example, would be fine. But while many patients use medical marijuana to treat the symptoms of serious illnesses, cannabis products are often not considered curative. The products, almost certain to have a niche market, will be joining a booming industry. Legal sales of marijuana are expected to rise to $5.7 billion this year, up from $4.4 billion last year, according to a report from the Acro Capital, a boutique investment bank. The recreational use of marijuana is legal in 4 states, plus the District of Columbia, where medical marijuana is allowed in 19 more. Mr. Hoffman, age 42, is quick to say that he is not a cannabis enthusiast and wants nothing to do with the recreational marijuana industry. He said that he considers Vero one of 5 companies licensed to sell medical marijuana products in New York, a pharmaceutical company. Dressed in a dark blue blazer and white button-down shirt, he looks like a Wall Street executive that he used to be, having spent nearly a decade in firms including J.P. Morgan Chase. After Wall Street, Mr. Huffman served as deputy controller for New York City. Part of his job involved analyzing the fiscal implications of medical marijuana. Just studying it with a group of economists and sophisticated financial analysts led me to believe that, wow, this is a multi-billion-dollar market, he said. The industry still faces a number of challenges because the federal government considers marijuana an illegal drug. Many banks refuse to work with companies in the cannabis business, leading to stories about trunks full of cash and covert money transfers. And these companies cannot take advantage of some of the tax breaks intended for small businesses. Vero spent thousands of dollars on its kosher certification. Mr. Huffman declined to say how much because he sees it as one small step along medical marijuana's march towards mainstream acceptance. The endorsement from a rabbi organization he hopes will help the products appear to a broader swath of consumers. There is no question, he said, that the number of patients that desire kosher products, coupled with battling the stigma associated with medical marijuana, made this a wise economic investment. Representatives of the Orthodox Union and Chicago Rabbi Council, which inspected Cresco, said that the idea of kosher medical marijuana had stirred much internal debate and that they would certify only medical marijuana and not products intended for a recreational market. Deciding to go forward with that certification process wasn't an easy decision, said Rabbi Elephant, the chief operating officer at the Orthodox Union's kosher division. But Rabbi Fishban, the administrator of kosher laws for the Chicago Rabbi Council, said he now expected to get more calls. What I thought would be, maybe I'll call it an amusing afternoon, he said about the inspection, really turned out to be a lot of lessons of kosher 101.
Well, from the Lincoln Journal-Star, it's been about a year since a major disturbance at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution resulted in deaths, injuries, and major damage. And the prison is still feeling the effects of it. 2 inmates died and 2 were injured. Nearly 20 prison workers were stranded and endangered in offices at the Yard Tower. And millions of dollars in damage at the maximum security prison was caused by fires, broken windows, and destruction of computers and cameras. It started at 2:20 on Mother's Day and lasted into the early morning hours of the next day. While mothers' times with their sons were wrapping up in the visitors area, an incident in the yard deteriorated into what Nebraska Ombudsman Marshall Lux called a full-blown prison riot. At the time, more than 1,000 inmates were housed at Tecumseh. Some of them have said the plan that day was to register a peaceful protest of conditions at the facility. Right before the riot started, several inmates were trying to get the administration to pay attention to a 2-page statement of grievances about solitary confinement, perks for some inmates and not others, disrespect by some staff and inexperienced staff. They also objected to being denied access to jobs, training, and self-betterment clubs that would help them prepare for a return to life outside of prison. A year later, the prison is not yet back to normal, and many of the previous complaints by inmates still continue to cause disgruntlement. Repairs to the building are not quite complete. The state has spent about $1.2 million this year and will spend another $2 million in next year's for costs related to the riot and upgrades. Insurance paid for another $1 million. A housing unit wall destroyed by inmates will cost $482,000 to replace with one that better meets prison security standards. And many yard changes along with doors and windows will cost $54,000. Fixes to the building have taken this long because it's hard to get contractors to do the job, said Senator Dan Watermeyer of Syracuse, whose district includes Tecumseh. They thought they were going to get 3 or 4 bids, he said, but they only got 1. The red tape, regulations, and inefficiencies of working on such a project kept companies from bidding. Nebraska Department of Corrections Services Director Scott Frakes said last week the facility is about 93% back to the way it was before the riot. For Nebraska Inspector General for Corrections Doug Kubernick, the question is this: is a return to the way the prison was before the riot a good thing or a bad thing? Because a year ago, the way it was, we had a riot. We still face the same challenges now as we did back then, he said. Kubernick started his new position in September, but before that kept track of Tecumseh and other prison issues as an aide to Senator Steve Lathrop. A serious staffing shortage continues and staff members are stressed, Kubernick said. Tension and security concerns raise the level of fear and stress. Frakes confirmed that the staff at the prison have been working long hours for the past 12 months. Corrections officers and other staff have been working 12-hour shifts, 4 a week, and sometimes more when needed. That includes almost 200 officers, corporals, sergeants, and lieutenants. Between January 1st and March 23rd alone, overtime pay was almost $350,000. In November, the Correction Department contracted with the Mental Health Association of Nebraska to provide crisis and trauma support to those who were directly or indirectly involved in the riot. The association sent 6 people to do a 1 to 3 hour group session with Tecumseh staff that included education and trauma support. The agency recommended how the department should work with staff to relieve tension and stress. Staff retention has been an ongoing issue, and salary has been one of the major issues affecting turnover and retention. No decisions have been made on compensation questions, but Frakes said they are being considered. Vacant positions and high turnover have made it more difficult to establish the level of activity that Frakes envisions for Tecumseh. But for inmates in several of the housing units, out-of-cell time is increasing and some programming is being added, Kobernick said. A shortage of mental health practitioners is one reason inmates aren't getting the treatment and mental health programs they need, according to a violence reduction program. We have a lot of guys at Tecumseh that are upset because they can't get the programming they need to be good candidates for parole, Kobernick said. A lack of flexibility across the system prevents moving inmates to where they can get needed programming. When your system is so over capacity and stressed, you don't have the tools available to run it the way it should be, Kobernick said. As of March 24th, Nebraska prisons were at 159% of design capacity, with over 5,000 inmates in all. Tecumseh has about 1,047 inmates, which is 87 more than it was ever designed to hold. Tecumseh Warden Brian Gage voluntarily retired suddenly in March and was replaced by Brad Hansen, who began his career with corrections in 1977. It was time for a change, Frakes told senators at a hearing in April. He said at the time, Hansen's leadership skills and vision uniquely qualified him to create a healing environment. Frakes told senators that when he visited Tecumseh in April, he saw much more engaging and respectful interaction with the inmates. The mood and the tone were good or better. Kobernick said he's seen Hansen throughout the prison, talking and listening to people, one of the things that a warden should be doing. Frakes said he went to Tecumseh in April and sat down with about 16 inmates who were eager to have his attention. Those listening sessions have had an effect on reducing tension. Omaha Senator Bob Criss said Frakes cooperated with the Department of Corrections during an investigation it completed when they tried to talk to him and senators. But committee members still aren't clear on what he's doing exactly to change the culture and to fix issues that have plagued the prisons for a number of years. The investigative committee definitely wants to see the department making more progress on adding more behavioral and mental health treatment programs. It's still an uneasy feeling for me not knowing what's happening, Criss said. The governor asked Criss a while ago to let Frakes and company do their jobs and stay out of the way, and he's willing to do that, he said, for at least a little while longer. The make or break for me, though, is going to be, do we have a safe environment, both for the prison guards and for the people behind bars, he said. One or two more incidents, and I think we'll have to take more oppressive action, he said. The prisons have been reporting a higher number of inmate on-staff assaults of late. My own gut tells me that if the temperature goes up in the summertime and the prison population stays consistent, we're going to have some issues, but I hope I'm wrong, he said.
Joanne Kaufman writes in the business section of the New York Times about George Washington sleeps here. Out of knee breeches, a star of Hamilton finds room to breathe and grill in the Bronx. When some people buy furniture, they consider only functionality and comfort. Others focus wholly on period charm or how well the prospective acquisition goes with everything else in the room. For Christopher Jackson, age 40, a Tony nominee for his portrayal of George Washington in the musical Hamilton, the issue is much more fundamental. Does the couch, the recliner, the dining table feel like home? Home is a word we use a lot, said Mr. Jackson's wife, Veronica Jackson, age 41, an actress and singer who had several dance hits in the 90s and is releasing a new single in June. If something feels like home, we get it, right? She said, turning to Mr. Jackson for confirmation. That it felt like home was why 6 years ago they chose their apartment, a 3-bedroom rental on the second floor of a 4-family house in the country club section of the Bronx. The couple had been living in Riversdale in the northwest part of the borough, but because the elder of their 2 children, CJ, age 11, has autism and attends a school in Glen Cove, New York on Long Island, they moved east and south. We wanted to be closer to the Zong's next bridge to make the drive easier, Ms. Jackson said. She found the apartment on Craigslist. Mr. Jackson liked what he saw on the video tour, and everything else fell effortlessly into place. That's how we know something is right, when it's easy, said Ms. Jackson, who these days is a real estate salesman for the New York Casa Group. The couple met in 2003 at an early reading of Lin-Manuel Miranda's In the Heights, and it was easy, and it was right, married in 2004. Mr. Jackson had a principal role in the subsequent Broadway production, reuniting with Mr. Miranda in Hamilton, the playwright's next venture. What with the chirps and trills of Cardinals and Blue Jays, the couple can forget they're in the city. There's a backyard with lots of rolling around room for CJ and his 6-year-old sister, Jalen, and for Sam, and affectionate Labrador dog. For Mr. Jackson, there's a patio off the kitchen for his much-loved grill. I use it all year long, he said. I've been known to put on my parka and cook a chicken breast outside in winter. When spring and summer come, I'm watching the Food Network. I'm all about Bobby Flay. 2 blocks away is Pelham Bay Park with a playground for CJ and Jadlin and bike paths for Mr. Jackson. On occasion, he's pedaled to the theater, and after the show, he returns to an enclave where there's space to breathe. If I can live where I can look directly up and see sky, that's a selling point for me, he said. And how about that neighbor who taped a poster reading, "Way to go, Chris," on Mr. Jackson's garage door the day after Hamilton won a Grammy? Miss Jackson is Bronx born and bred, and her parents are a 7-minute drive away. As soon as I met that lady there, he said, I was like, okay, let's go to the Bronx. I can't imagine our lives without Veronica's parents. I really can't. Family is imperative for us, Mr. Jackson said. I'm a bit of an immigrant since I come from Southern Illinois. So to be pulled in right away with her huge family and extended family gave me a sense of always being at home. This particular piece of the Bronx looks like a toy workshop. Jalen's Barbie doll accessories are stashed on the bookshelves in the living room. Spillover lines the floor. CJ's Legos, his supplies vast, obscure the top of the dining table, which when cleared can comfortably seat 8, but has accommodated 11 or 12 at holiday gatherings. Paper, colored pencils, crayons, and paints are abundant. We encourage our kids to be artistic as possible and to explore as much as they can, said Mr. Jackson, who does his own artistic exploration down the hall in the music studio with the help of 9 guitars and a keyboard. Luckily, in this age of technology, you don't need as much space as you used to have a viable recording space, said Mr. Jackson, who with the composer Bill Sherman won an Emmy in 2011 for a song they wrote for Sesame Street. If I got 15 minutes before I head out, I'll pick up a guitar and play for a minute. That's a real comfort. He said similar store by his books, my Bible I've had since I was a teenager, Mr. Jackson said. My James Baldwin books, I'm going to read them all again this summer. They mark a time in my life when I completely shifted my thinking on who I was as a black man, as a father, a husband, a person in the public eye. A particular treasure is a copy of Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. Mr. Miranda brought it back from the White House, where in the spring of 2009, he performed a number from an embodied show about the first Secretary of the United States Treasury. President had just been elected, and I really wanted to be at the White House too, and instead I was on stage doing In the Heights, Mr. Jackson recalled. It's the only time I've ever been jealous of Lin Miranda. He walks into my dressing room with a book, and I'm like, oh, great. And he says, open the book, dummy. And there it was, with an all but illegible signature, to Chris, Dream Big Dreams, Barack Obama. Mr. Jackson just shot a pilot for Bull, a TV drama about jury selection, created by Dr. Phil McCroy, the television personality, and Paul Antesca, the screenwriter. Decorating has long taken a back step to career building and child rearing, although once in a while something new for his home does cross his mind. But the chocolate brown corduroy sectional stays in a picture. I think that's the couch is the most important thing here because everyone falls asleep on it, Miss Jackson said. Everyone, it seems, except Mr. Jackson. Sleeping is not something I do well, he said. Unsurprisingly, the Kuzina coffee maker on the kitchen counter is his very first stop of the day. Mr. Jackson bought a Keurig coffee maker and a supply of its coffee-filled pods for his theater dressing room, believing it would solve all my issues, he said. But after the first cup, I was like, can't do it. The idea is fantastic, but you can't beat a brewed cup of coffee. At some point, Mr. Jackson added, hosting a mug, I'll get away from it and practice yoga first thing in the morning, but right now, it's coffee.
Well, from the World Herald, senior architecture students at the University of Nebraska Lincoln were going to learn about urban planning by designing a mixed-use suburban development. But then ConAgra Foods in Omaha announced that it would move its headquarters to Chicago and reduce its Omaha workforce. The corporate campus, a riverfront landmark for decades, suddenly became a potential redevelopment site with serious implications for downtown Omaha's future. This seems like a really important movement, said Omaha architect Emily Anderson, who would teach the architecture class with Jeff Diold, her husband and partner for Diold Anderson Architecture of Omaha. So the 30 students seized the moment and spent the spring semester making the ConAgra campus, Heartland of America Park and surrounding area, about 120 acres in all, their senior studio project. The result was 30 different ideas for the future of perhaps the most valuable, high-profile chunk of real estate in the region. There is more to this story. There we go. And there's at least a chance that the students' work can influence what actually happens on the site. Diold and Anderson required the students to include residences and anchor tenants and encourage them to show the park lagoon as filled in or greatly shrunk. You've had to have a really good reason to keep it, Anderson said. Otherwise, they let loose the students' creativity and fledgling knowledge of urban design. Now they're looking for ways to let more people see and discuss these students' ideas. They've had an opportunity to take a visionary approach to what a city could look like using the ConAgra site as a starting point, Diold said. We don't want to limit what they would do. The site was once home to Omaha's Jobbers Canyon, more than 20 brick buildings that eventually came down to make way for ConAgra in the late 1980s. It remains the largest historic district ever demolished in the United States. Now, with the student designs completed, Anderson said, we think the proposals have the ability to further conversation for the ConAgra Heartland of America Park site, as well as the riverfront, and are interested in looking at various outlets for that discussion. On March the 4th, the students walked through the property with Anderson and Diold as guides. They noticed that the downtown street grid, square blocks, and right-angle streets ended at 10th Street with ConAgra's suburban-style campus. Tear them down, one student said to the existing ConAgra buildings. They walked to the Lewis and Clark Landing north of the campus and around the lagoon, stopping at the small deck that overlooks the railroad tracks along the Missouri River. By early April, students showed preliminary designs to professionals. One architect suggested that a shared green space should be in the middle of a residential neighborhood rather than along one side. Another pointed out potential barriers to pedestrian traffic. I know I would never want to live in that neighborhood, one reviewer told a student, calling the density of the planned buildings oppressive. With the plans revised and the semester over, most of the designs would indeed remove the existing ConAgra buildings. ConAgra, of course, does still occupy the office campus, and actual plans for the site haven't been announced. ConAgra spokesman Christopher Gertchner said the company is focused on establishing a footprint for the approximately 1,200 positions that will remain in Omaha. Meanwhile, with their class assignments coming due, several of the students gave people direct access to the Missouri River on the site's eastern edge. Most either ignored the railroad tracks or proposed covering them with boardwalks or other structures. Students' proposals included an NFL riverfront stadium, inlets to let the river flow more between city blocks, more old market scale buildings, and even new business districts resembling the Jobbers Canyon Warehouse District. This is a unique case, said Professor Jeffrey Day, director of the UNL Architecture Program. We have the opportunity to look at this historical situation in Omaha with the ConAgra campus as potential development. What I like is that the students are addressing a real situation in the community. The students' ideas could influence thinking about the property, Day said. If the city hired a consultant to do a plan, there would be a lot of constraints on what they could do, he said. All of the students had some elements of reality in their projects, but they allowed themselves to be speculative beyond those. It's important so people can see what possibilities could be. It's great to see this kind of independent speculation, he said. For example, filling in the park lagoon wouldn't bother Kaylee Baylor from Fort Collins, Colorado. Her design kept the main diagonal entry street to the property and a parking garage, but installed sports fields where the lagoon is now. Student William Pajowski of Lincoln, whose design showed long glass tubes enclosing buildings on the site, said some of the ideas are a little far-reaching, but that there are valuable concepts or elements. Omaha architect Mary Schukert was one of the professionals who critiqued the student work. He was Omaha planning director when Jobbers Canyon came down to make way for the campus. He especially liked the plan that extended the city's small block street grid toward the river and broke up the blocks into lots, much like the city's original layout. I thought that was a different and creative approach, Schukert said. We're so prone to think about mega-scale projects and full block elements and giant parking garages. The students didn't have to worry about money, of course, so that wouldn't inhibit their creativity, Schukert said. But part of creativity is making great things within financial constraints. You have to park cars, he said. Student Charles Week of Omaha, whose design shows river water flowing into the eastern edge of downtown, said the site's eventual developers will use their own plans, but the students' work may prompt thinking about sustainable riverfront practices. Anderson, the architect and teacher, said that for the students, the project was a chance to learn about large-site urban architecture. For Omaha, she said, it's a start.
Alyssa Hopper writes from Louisville, Kentucky about Taylor and his stripes at the racetrack. After the silks are off, top jockeys often don his custom-made suits. The morning after Victor Espinoza pulled off the unthinkable, winning the first Triple Crown in 37 years abroad American Pharoah, everyone in the jockeys room at Belmar Park, not only the riders, had an added bounce in their step. Among the smiling visitors was Andy Laguna, a tailor who has dressed many top jockeys, including Espinoza, ensuring that they are as colorfully dressed off the racetrack as they are on it. In fact, Laguna's custom fashions received prominent display during the Triple Crown run. Espinoza owns about 6 of his custom sport clothes and shirts. But on this day, Laguna was not there to take the measurements of Espinoza or any of his other clients. He was there to congratulate him on his historic sweep and to bask in the communal afterglow. Now he's really busy, but he'll still be the same man to me, Laguna, age 68, said of Espinoza. He's still very humble, just a very nice, friendly guy, except he's on top of the world. Likewise, Laguna, with his towering frame and jet black hair, is a fixture in jockeys' rooms across the country. Wearing his own designs, he is given an all-access pass, even helping himself to the jockeys' buffet, all the while waving and saying hello to riders as they pass. Maintaining relationships with his clients is how he keeps up his business, and he has a lot of friends in high places. He has dressed celebrities, politicians, businessmen, and Kentucky basketball royalty, including the coaches and Rick Pinto. Campero style is simple. Pinto is a little more adventurous, but since he returned to Kentucky as Louisville's coach, he is really big time and now buys his suits elsewhere, Laguna said. Laguna was introduced to the racetrack life about 10 years ago when he made a custom suit for Gene Kruger, who won the Triple Crown aboard Seattle Slough in 1977. Kruger brought him to the jockeys room at Keeneland and told the writers, according to Laguna, "You guys need good clothes? Get them from Andy. Just look at my clothes." It took a little while for Laguna to learn the etiquette of the jock's room. When he first came here, he was trying too hard to maintain our friendship when we were working, Espinoza said. So he finally figured it out, and now he's a pro. He knows when to talk about making suits and when to let us get back to racing. Laguna was born in Bombay, India, but jokes that he was part Italian because of his mastery of fine Italian-style suits. He was a model and actor in Bollywood before going on to learn the tailoring trade in Japan, Italy, London, Hong Kong, and New York. In 1976, he settled in Lexington, Kentucky, and established his business, Continental Fashions. But the place Laguna feels most at home is the racetrack. There he can spend time with what he calls his extended family. When I look at beautiful horses, I admire them so much, he said. I'm not good at betting. I'm here to see nice people and nice horses. It's great company. One of his biggest clients is Joe Rosero, who won the Kentucky Derby in 2013 aboard Orb and was to ride Shagoff in the Derby on Saturday. Rosero and Espinoza, who was to ride Whitmore in the Derby, have even gone to Laguna's house. When I go there, they treat me so good. So when they're in Lexington, I want to take care of them too, Laguna said. Laguna travels with a suitcase carrying the tools of his trade and is often seen carrying bags of suits, jackets, shirts, and ties to deliver to his clients. His custom suits run from about $995 to $1,895, but ever the salesman, he points out how reasonable that is compared with most prices for custom-made suits in the United States. It takes him about 6 weeks to make a suit. Even though he uses less fabric for jockeys frames, their suits actually take longer to make. The smaller a suit gets, it is harder to sew, he said. Sure, there's less fabric, but the workmanship is difficult. Espinato said his taste in sports coats depended on what time of the year it was. He said he usually just told Laguna what colors he liked and let him go to work. It's like someone putting me on a horse and telling me how to ride, Espinato said. He knows how to make suits. I don't know how to make them. But if he comes back and they don't fit me right, only then would I say something. On Wednesday, Laguna was in the Churchill Downs jockey room. He saw the veteran jockeys Robbie Albero and Corey Learn, who was to ride Moto in the Derby on Saturday. Albero, who has several jackets made by Laguna, told him he would be wearing one on Oaks Day. And then the talk quickly turned to one of Laguna's golden rules: never give anything away. He should be giving me free jackets because a lot of people will see me wearing it, and I make it look good, Albero said. Leonard laughed and quickly chimed in. I bet even after the Triple Crown, he didn't give Victor anything for free.
From the World Herald, when people from Russia and Australia want to head to Nebraska, you know something big is going to happen. A coast-to-coast total solar eclipse will occur inside a 65 to 70-mile wide swath that will make its way across the country on August 21st, 2017. It will start in northwest Oregon before passing through the nation's midsection, wrapping up in South Carolina. In between, parts of 12 other states will be prime viewing areas in what's called the path of totality. That includes about 3 square miles of southwest Iowa and a diagonal strip all across Nebraska from the panhandle to the southeast corner. It will be the first total eclipse seen in the United States since 1979. The next one won't be until 2024. People inside and just outside the swath of best viewing are primed for an onslaught of visitors from across the globe. Omaha is about 50 miles north of the prime path. Odds are fairly good you've never witnessed anything like a total eclipse of the sun, said David Kriegler, a physics instructor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And not since 1918 have we had a coast-to-coast total eclipse. When the sun is totally blocked out by the moon, Kriegler said, the sky dims enough to see stars during the daytime, and night birds and animals begin to stir. Temperatures will also be lower that day in the eclipse area. Lincoln, he said, is on the edge of the prime viewing area and will get a 1-minute, 24-second view. Grand Island, right in the center of the path, will get a 2-minute, 34-second look. The Stir Museum of the Prairie and Pioneer in Grand Island will be ground zero, said Brad Malema, executive director of the museum. The property's south end will be the dead center of the total eclipse, he said. This is something quite unique and special. The coming eclipse was brought to his attention 3 or 4 years ago. For the past year, he's been involved in weekly meetings about it. We're still in the planning stages, but we've been getting a lot of calls, he said. In Grand Island, the total eclipse will start at 12 o'clock, 58 minutes. The Bureau is working with the Stir Museum to plan educational events ahead of the eclipse, including weekend programs and educational booths. The Grand Island area is accustomed to handling major events such as the Nebraska State Fair. But the August 2017 total eclipse, which will fall on Monday, will be the real deal, Malema said. I think we'll sell out all the hotels in the region. In Alliance, which will get a 2-minute, 30-second prime viewing spectacle, the Visitors Bureau director said preparations are underway. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, said Kevin Howard, who also runs the nearby tourist attraction at Carhinge. There's no second chance on an eclipse. He expects all 216 hotel rooms in Alliance to fill for the total eclipse, which will begin just before noon Mountain Time. He also said an expected 14,000 hotel rooms across the route will be probably sold out up to 3 days in advance. We're planning a 4-day event leading up to the eclipse, he said. Alliance officials plan to bring in portable planetarium, and they've arranged for educational programs, bands, and food. Hotels are keeping a waiting list because most establishments don't let people book rooms more than 50 weeks out. People want to make sure they're in place for this, he said. People have been trying to book rooms now for 2 years. Howard said he's had inquiries from Australia and Russia. A coalition of about 200 Nebraska communities along the eclipse's route from Alliance to Beatrice are touting the event, which could total up to about $30 million in tourism for Nebraska. At the Nebraska Tourism Commission, officials said they're expecting big crowds at top viewing locations across the state with 4,000 to 10,000 people at each site. The commission said it's working with several viewing sites that lie in the path of the eclipse. One prime viewing spot is the Sandhills, which GreatAmericanEclipse.com said was one of the best viewing destinations. Kriegler said UNO is making its own viewing plans. We plan to have telescopes set up in a public area for the general viewing, he said. The exact location is still up in the air. We're having discussions with the Omaha Astronomical Society. The farther someone is from the center line of the path of totality, Kriegler said, the shorter the eclipse time will be visible. The sun will also be less obscured. Omahans will get to see 98% of the total eclipse. The almost total eclipse for the Omahans will begin at 11:38 a.m. with maximum viewing at 1:04 p.m. and partial viewing ending about 2:30. People's views, of course, will be dependent on weather. A local forecast that includes clouds or rain could push fans elsewhere. Of course, 2017 is a long time away still.
Yes, it is. Well, Charles McGrath writes from Minneapolis about obsessively mining a familiar landscape, and Mrs. Louise Erdick is, along with Garrison Keeler and Ann Patchett, among a handful of American writers crazy enough to want to own a bookstore here, or hers rather, in the Kentwood neighborhood here, is in what used to be a dentist's office, though perhaps not a very busy one. Neighbors remember that the dentist was often asleep in his own chair. Miss Erdick's store, Birch Bark Books, features a canoe hanging upside down from the ceiling and an old Roman Catholic confessional that has been repurposed as a display case. There's also a reading loft marked by a birch log railing and a counter displaying Native American jewelry and artifacts. Miss Erdick, who's part Opgigi, said recently that she started the business so she could have a place to sell such things when she brought back from frequent trips to the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, the home of her tribe, and because it was something she could do with her 4 daughters. In the beginning, she recalled, she was so clueless that she didn't know that unsold books could be returned. She laughed and said it might have been easier just to become a dentist. Mr. Erdick, whose new novel, La Rose, comes out on Tuesday, was born in Minnesota, grew up in Wapton, North Dakota, where her mother, who is half French American and half Opgiji, and her father, a German American, taught at a boarding school run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She attended Dartmouth as part of its first co-ed class. She was so quiet, she said, that people must have assumed that she was stoned all the time. For the last 20-odd years, she has spent most of her time in Minneapolis, which has a sizable Native American population. The unofficial center of that community is east of Franklin Avenue, and Miss Erlich, shy and gracious, is a familiar presence there. One recent Friday, she stopped by the Minnesota American Indian Center, where she bought some beaded barrettes at the gift shop and at a nearby gallery, All My Relations Arts, where her daughter is an artist, has a show of her paintings. Everyone recognized her, but no one made a fuss. Native people have lived here for generations, which is why I feel so at home, she said, but they're always in motion. They're always going back and forth from the city to their reservation. That's how they keep their families together, she said. They put hundreds of thousands of miles on their car. Just then, she recognized one. The license plate said OJIKWE, blending 2 words to signify Opgiji women. La Rose forms a sort of a trilogy with her book, The Plague of Doves, a National Book Award winning of Roundhouse. Like them, it is set in and around an Indian reservation that readers have come to know as her version of Faulkner's Yelkenbach County, a landscape where many of the same characters or their forebears show up, and again, where the past is part of the present. Philip Roth said of Miss Erdick in an email, she is like Faulkner, one of the great American regionists, bearing the dark knowledge of her place as he did his. He added, she is by now among the very best of American writers. Mr. Roth first came upon her work while judging a short story contest for the Atlantic and reading part of what eventually became Love Medicine, 1984, her first novel, loosely following several generations of an extended Opgiji family. It almost immediately established her as an essential writer on Native American life, a subject that American fiction had tended to neglect. I can see it, Ms. Erdick said of her image setting, which has now figured in some 15 of her books. And she explained it was mostly based on the world she grew up in. Sometimes I think I should place it somewhere specific, and sometimes I think it's better the way it is. The title character of the new novel is a young boy descended from generations of female LaRosas who was given to another family after his father accidentally shoots that family's son, LaRosa's best friend. At first, uncomprehending, LaRose becomes a wise and sad ambassador, shuffling back and forth between the two homes. Missouri said such transfers really did happen sometimes. My mother once mentioned offhand that it wasn't totally unusual, she said. I didn't set out to write this book, but that's how it works sometimes. I started writing and I couldn't stop. My mother drops a little pebble in my brain and on it goes. What they're not saying is she was married to the author who wrote The Broken Chord.
Oh.
Yeah. Michael Doonan or Dolan or something like that. They raised Adam and he died. There was a movie made, The Broken Chord.
That one.
Yeah.
Huh.
So she was married to him for many, many years.
Interesting. Well, wouldn't be Mother's Day without a story about mothers.
Well, yeah.
I wouldn't think you could not have that. Well, here's a good one. During the post-war years, Nebraska woman had her own personal baby boom. 16 births, including 3 sets of twins. Lucille Bowman didn't plan on so many children. I only wanted 4, she says with a chuckle. We had 4 times that, I guess. On Mother's Day, Lucille can look upon a very busy and healthy life from a perspective of a 92-year-old woman. And she stays busy in the northern Nebraska village of Spencer, population 455, 7 miles north of the Niobrara River in Boyd County. She crochets, knits, plays cards, visits with friends, and attends her Lutheran church. She owns a home in town, and each day she drives to the senior center at noon for dinner, as folks in small town America have often called the midday meal. It's a peaceful life compared to what the younger days were like. Raising 14 children, 2 died in infancy, was a load of work. She wasn't like the nursery rhyme woman who lived in a shoe and had so many children that she didn't know what to do. Lucille knew exactly what to do. That included providing meals, guidance, and a list of farm chores for a whole lot of kids named Bowman. She was always cooking and cleaning, said daughter Linda. We had meat and potatoes a lot, and she baked bread every day. Our dad wanted us to work all the time, so we didn't play too much. He had us out working in the field. When the kids did play, it might be tossing a ball over the barn roof, an old-time team game called Ante-I-Over, or climbing trees and buildings. Mom and Dad never said, don't climb because you might fall. Linda said, we got a few stitches, but no broken bones. They grew up not in Spencer, but on a family farm 2 miles away. The second floor of their frame house had no heat, Linda recalled, and several girls sometimes shared a bed in winter, alternating directions like sardines. Occasionally, she said, you'd get a foot in the face. But it was a good life overall, she said, and the siblings remain friendly and loving today. Their mom, Lucille Mae Johnson, was born in Spencer on November 24th, 1923, and grew up in town. Carl Darrell Bowman, known as Darrell, was from around Lynch, Nebraska, and served in the Navy toward the end of World War II, including duty in post-war Hiroshima. The couple married in the first year of the U.S. baby boom, 1946, and moved to the farm outside Spencer and had their first twins in 48. Annetta was stillborn, and Gary lived to 64, most of his life in Norfolk. The youngest, Daniel, died of pneumonia at 6 weeks in 1966. The 13 in between are still living between ages 65 and 51. None headed for big city lights, and 8 reside in Nebraska, small towns. There's Robert, who's 65, who lives in O'Neill. Susan, 62, who lives in Valparaiso. Bruce, 61, lives in Inman. David, 58, in Plainview. Darlene in Bristow. Carl, who's 57, in Clearwater. Alan lives right there in Spencer, and Trudy in Chadron. The non-Nebraskans are Jeannie, who lives in Farmersville, Illinois, Linda of Sun Valley, Arizona, Karen, Gregory, who live in South Dakota, Janet, who lives in Larchwood, Iowa, and John, who lives in Pierre, South Dakota. Now, note that a year or so after Linda was born, Lucille had twins David and Darlene, now 58, and then Carol and Karen, now 57. We had 2 cribs, their mother said, with a baby in each end. Twins run through the extended family. Lucille's dad had twin sisters and her mother had twin cousins. Lucille has 4 sets of twin grandchildren. She will receive Mother's Day cards and calls, but the favorite days for this mother are Easter and Thanksgiving, when she rents a hall because many of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren come to visit. Linda said she also brings her 5 children to Spencer in the summer. When I was young, we went barefoot all summer long. My bottoms of my feet would get so leathery I could step on a cactus, she said, and I have good feet today. Alan Bowman, the 13th in the birth order, doesn't recall multiple siblings under one blanket in winter. By the time the oldest ones moved out, he said there was plenty of room. But what he does recall from childhood is his older sisters. It was like having a permanent babysitter all the time to keep track of you. Daryl, the dad, died in 1986, just before the couple's 40th wedding anniversary. In 1995, Alan bought the family farm, where he rents out half of the 168 acres for crops and livestock on the other half. The area around Spencer is known as a sportsman's paradise with lots of hunting and fishing. Alan said it's a good place to live and he enjoys not having to face city traffic. In recent times, Lucille has knit afghans for each of her offspring. When I was raising them, she said the children never knew I could knit or crochet. In all, she has 35 grandchildren and 25 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. It's not a big extended family, but it's not as big as it might have been. Or it is a big extended family, but not as big as it might have been. Though Lucille's kids stayed true to their small town roots, none of them had the big families of their own. Only Linda has had as many as 5 children, a large brood by today's standards, but all the others have had fewer. Lucille graduated from high school, and Daryl went only through the 9th grade. Their grandchildren include a lawyer, a college speech instructor, an audiologist, an early childhood educator, members of many professions. And though she's visited California as well as Niagara Falls and elsewhere, Lucille spent most of her 92 years right there around Spencer. So no, this old woman never lived in a shoe, but how'd she know what to do with so many children? Well, I don't know. Lucille said it was a lot of work, but I lived through it, I guess. I'd say she did live through it. That's a lot of kids. Well, happy Mother's Day again. And I think this brings us to the end of another Sunday full of good news.
Yes, it does. And we return you to Emily in the control room.
All right. That brings us to the end of the morning meeting for
Imagine having
morning.
all those brothers and sisters.
Earlier.
Of course, I'm an only child, so it's hard for me to imagine one.
Oh.
I really can't imagine that many.
Yeah. Did you ever hear of the broken cord?
I don't think so.
It's on fetal alcohol.
Oh, you told me about that. Is that a story once?
Become with a pint of 1% milk. Monday, May the 9th,